My name is Don Steluto. I'm the co-director for the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government here at the University of Notre Dame, and it's a delight to welcome you to this morning's session. It's titled Martin Luther King Jr., Barry Goldwater, and the Living Tradition of American Freedom. This is a session sponsored by the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government, and we are grateful for the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture for providing this opportunity and a superb conference. We have a fascinating topic to explore together this morning in conversation with two excellent scholars. The first of our panelists is Nicholas Buccola. Professor Buccola is the Dr. Jules K. Whitehill Professor of Humanism and Ethics in the Department of Government at Claremont McKenna College. Our focus this morning will be his book, published just a few weeks ago. It's titled One Man's Freedom, Goldwater, King, and the Struggle Over an American Ideal, a book that I found to be a compelling story, well-written, and thought-provoking, all the things that you want in a book. Professor Buccola is the author of numerous books on American political thought, including The Fire is Upon Us, James Baldwin, William F. Buckley Jr., and The Debate Over Race in America, 2019, and The Political Thought of Frederick Douglass, In Pursuit of American Liberty, 2012. He's also the editor of Abraham Lincoln and Liberal Democracy, 2016. In addition to his academic publications, Professor Buccola is an essayist. It's a rather challenging form of writing that requires special skill and talent and an ability to speak to broad audiences. It's a skill that I think has come out very clearly in this book, Nick. We can find his essays in a range of publications, including the Review of Politics and American Political Thought, the New York Times, Salon, the Baltimore Sun, and Dissent. Responding to Professor Buccola's book this morning is Melvin Rogers. It is a pleasure to welcome Professor Rogers back to Notre Dame, and especially to this panel. Professor Rogers is Professor of Political Science and Associate Director of Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at Brown University. He has wide-ranging interests in contemporary democratic theory and the history of American and African-American political thought. He is the author of The Undiscovered Dewey, Religion, Morality, and the Ethos of Democracy, 2008, and The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African-American Political Thought, 2023. Like Professor Buccola, you will find Professor Rogers' articles in a range of academic and popular publications, including Dissent, The Atlantic, and Boston Review. This morning, we will begin with Professor Buccola offering an overview of the book. Professor Rogers will follow with his thoughts about the book, the topic in general, and his additional insights and questions about this period in American political history. That will leave us time afterward for questions from you and our further discussion, that is among all of us, on the range of topics and issues prompted by this book. Before turning things over to Professor Buccola, let me say that this book was a pleasure to read. The book offers the story of two significant figures in American political and social history, Martin Luther King Jr. and Barry Goldwater, drawing from their speeches and many of their statements. The story tells us about them as individuals, but also as symbols for definitions of American freedom that were often and still are often in tension. Both men raised critical questions about freedom in America at the time, and as Professor Buccola reveals, they and their ideas were in dialogue with each other, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. Ideas about freedom set in rugged individualism could be pitted against conscientious collectivism. Those are both phrases from the book. Interestingly, both men shared a common objective: to advance their understandings of freedom so that the average everyday people could live everyday lives in fulfillment of a legacy that each sought to claim. Historical narratives that offer a comparison of ideas can be tricky because sources don't always line up perfectly, so research must be done well, and the development of the context, engagement between ideas, and telling the story adequately, that is, the power of the narrative, all require considerable space. However, big books don't always get read. Here, though, Nicholas has done a great job of accomplishing these things and done so rather well. The reader is reminded in the book that there is much to learn about the period as well as concepts about American freedom in the 1950s and 1960s. The book further reminds us that there is much to learn about the nuances of American political and social history. In so doing, the book naturally made me, and I would imagine others, think about the state of political and social dialogue in our day and how that story may be written in the future. Sir John Henry Newman has suggested in his essay on the development of Christian doctrine that it is sometimes necessary for an idea to change with new contexts and situations, precisely in order to remain the same. Newman's ideas as a foundation for this conference provide us with the perfect philosophical setting for our topic this morning. Thank you, Professor Bukola, for writing this book, and thank you, Professor Rogers, for sharing your insights and ideas. Nick?
Thank you so much for being here. This is quite a conference. There's like a lot going on, so I really appreciate you coming over here. I'm going to try to do, so I've been on the road most of the last 2 months talking about this book, and usually I have about 45 minutes or an hour to do what I'm going to try to do in 25 minutes right now, but I'm not really going to do all of it, but I'll give you a sense of the book and some of the key moments. And I want to start out with Goldwater and King themselves. So here is Barry Goldwater in July 1964, and accepting the Republican nomination for president.
And let our republicanism, so focused and so dedicated, not be made fuzzy and futile by unthinking and stupid labels. I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.
All right, for the sake of time, what's coming next is a comment about moderation in pursuit of justice is no virtue. So extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, the most famous lines from Goldwater's convention speech, written by one of my predecessors at Claremont McKenna College, Harry Jaffa, which is a strange twist of fate that here I am now at Claremont McKenna College talking about those lines. As a professor, I'm not at Claremont McKenna as we speak. Let's see if I can do this without. Here's King.
I come here to urge every person under the sound of my voice to go to the polls on the 3rd of November and vote your convictions. Now, I know you're intelligent people, and I don't need to tell you who you should vote for. I don't have any fear about that. You know who to vote for. I'm just asking you to vote. Now, just if you need a little information on my convictions at this point, I must honestly admit to you that I am not going to vote for Mr. Goldwater.
Okay. So that was King about a week before the election. And there we go. We can do this. Oh, look at that. Oh, my gosh. So what's on this screen, by the way, is not on that screen, so that's why that had to look over my shoulder. Okay. So the sort of question that I began this project with, I wrote a book about James Baldwin and William F. Buckley Jr. and the debate they had at the Cambridge Union in 1965, and it's this dramatic moment with this leading writer of the civil rights movement, leading writer of the conservative movement, squaring off on this international stage, arguing about race and the American dream. As I worked on that book, I had an idea for another book in the works, which was I was really struck by the centrality of freedom, the concept of freedom in these two movements. I'm a political theorist by training. I teach a class called What is Freedom? I was really interested in the idea of these two movements both marching under the banner of freedom and yet being so deeply at odds. So when Goldwater is uttering those words about pledging himself to extremism in defense of liberty outside of the Cal Palace in San Francisco, the largest civil rights demonstration since the March on Washington is happening under banners of freedom. Folks are opposing Goldwater's nomination for president. And so I had this idea to write this big book about freedom in this era and these two movements. So I had, Goldwater and King and various activists and intellectuals all in this proposal. And my editor, an editor that Melvin and I share at Princeton, said, Nick, there are limits to book bindery technology. Like, this is like way too much going on here. So you need to narrow your scope a little bit. And so what then kind of evolved was the idea of maybe this is volume 2 in a trilogy where I'm thinking about the civil rights movement and conservative movements together. So I was raised Catholic, I think in threes, and so I was like, a trilogy, I can get behind that. And so here we are. And so I was, went into the project with really thinking about this idea of freedom, both King and Goldwater as, individuals who are talking about freedom, who are pursuing various actions that are related to this idea of freedom. And also I wanted to get a sense of King and Goldwater as symbols, as sort of symbols of movements. So part of what I wanted to capture, that I thought was really, the Buckley Baldwin book gave me the excuse to do, is thinking about these movements together, not just capture these individuals, but capture the cross current, capture, how King was perceived as a leader of a freedom movement by those who supported him and how he was perceived by those who opposed him, and the same thing with Goldwater. And so I have this line, the most dangerous men in America here. This comes from first an idea that King expressed about Goldwater. So after the election, after Goldwater is defeated, spoiler alert, he loses badly. So Goldwater is defeated. King is interviewed by the author Alex Haley. And this interview ends up being published in Playboy magazine in early 1965. One of the questions that Haley asks King in this interview is, he says, the first question is, if you were relegated to the proverbial desert island, what book would you bring with you if you only bring one book? It's a good icebreaker for your classes if you want to use it. And King says, well, I'm a minister, so I'd go with the Bible. But if I couldn't choose the Bible, I'd choose Plato's Republic, which is, a teacher of political theory. I was happy to hear that. And then Haley had a great follow-up, which could also be an interesting or maybe awkward icebreaker, which is that if you could send one person to the proverbial desert island, who would you send? And King said, if I had to choose somebody, I'd probably choose Mr. Goldwater. And King explains himself. I love the next line. King says, if they would feed him, of course. I am nonviolent, And then he says, but Goldwater should be on a desert island politically. And he says, I think before the election, before he was defeated, he was the most dangerous man in America. Although I don't think he himself is a racist, he gave aid and comfort to the most extreme elements in American politics. And for that reason, I thought he was the most dangerous man in America. Goldwater never said that about King specifically. Goldwater, in fact, didn't say much about King, which is an important part of the story. There's a lot of the story is captured in the silences of Goldwater on not only King, but a lot of these questions of civil rights. But Goldwater, and I think the sort of legion of supporters he had, they were deeply opposed to Martin Luther King. One thing I've been pointing out to audiences, and many folks in this room are probably aware of this, but when we think about King, we think of this like sort of universally acclaimed leader. And there's often a story told, he was acclaimed, and then he started to get too loud about Vietnam and stuff, and then he became much more unpopular. That's not accurate. So I've been kidding around with my colleagues in my department that I'm now a quantitative political scientist because I am going to cite a poll, 2 polls actually. So I'm really quantitative. The Pew surveyed folks and that sort of did the approval-disapproval rating of Martin Luther King in May 1963. And I've been asking audiences, and audiences know because of my lead-up, they're actually way more pessimistic than so I'm not even going to ask you because you'll actually underguess. But the approval of Martin Luther King among white respondents in May 1963 was about 34% approved of King, and so over 60% had an unfavorable view of Martin Luther King in May 1963. So an overwhelming majority. Now you might be thinking, well, that was May 1963, Nick. August 1963, he delivered the March on Washington speech, which everybody loves. I mean, it's quoted by everyone across the ideological spectrum now. So maybe that just totally changed public opinion. Martin Luther King, sorry, it didn't. After he gives that speech, folks are polled in 1964, and King's approval rating goes up by about 4% among white respondents. So it's important to know that King was not a universally loved figure in this period, and the American right, and the folks who are supporting Goldwater, that approval rating is even lower. One of the sort of line that I use in the epilogue to talk about King as the most dangerous man in America comes from J. Edgar Hoover, who ideologically is a complicated story, but J. Edgar Hoover ends up playing a key role in what happens to King and where he is by the end of this story I tell in the book in 1964. So I want to just give you a sense. Again, it's a long, as Don said, it's a long, and thank you for that generous introduction, by the way, Don. It's a long book. This book, my contract said it'd be 100,000 words. And I was in like 1963, in the sort of timeline, and I was already at like 150,000 words. And so when I handed in my first draft, it was 175,000 words, which is, one of my friends said, that's 75% more than what they wanted, Nick, which is true, but it got a little bit shorter. But so there's a lot going on in this book, but I really pick up the Buckley Baldwin story. I had these parallel lives. They're born 15 months apart from each other, and I have this climactic moment. I sort of knew how it was going to end. This one I did not know, and in the archive was actually much, much more vast, because not only was I writing about King and Goldwater and what they said and did, but also the way they're covered, the way they're perceived by people who both loved them and did not. And so I just want to give you a sense. The narrative in this one picks up, I get back, in a little bit into their early lives, but Goldwater's about 20 years older than King, so it's not the parallel lives approach I used in the last book, but the narrative really picks up in the mid-1950s. So Goldwater is elected to the Senate in 1952. He's a dark horse candidate. He's in a state that's 2-1 Democrat to Republican. He's running against the Senate Majority Leader. He's a complete outsider. He's a businessman who's been on the Phoenix City Council. He doesn't think he has any chance of winning. Surprise, surprise, he wins. And when he gets to the Senate, the important thing to know is that he finds out pretty quickly, he's not really interested in legislating and horse trading and building coalitions. He's not really interested in being a senator. But his colleagues recognize in him the capacity to sell things, sell ideas. And so they send him out on the road. They make him the Senate Republican campaign chair in his first term. And so he's out on the road with a message. So my first chapter is called Prophets with the PH Rising. So Goldwater is on the road with his gospel of freedom, spreading it around. And there's a couple things I want to highlight about Goldwater's philosophy of freedom to kind of set the table for our conversation. One is Goldwater, goes out and gives speeches all over the place, all over the country, to civic groups, to religious groups, anybody who will listen. And he's giving these speeches, and there's kind of a few things that I'll highlight. One is that he starts every speech by saying, this is like 1955. Think of the timing here. Freedom is in peril. Like, we tend to think about the mid-1950s as a time of great consensus in American politics, but not for Goldwater. He says freedom is in peril. One line that I've been, just sort of using to sort of give people a sense of the rhetoric. Goldwater tells young Republicans in 1955, I don't actually need the notes, I can just kind of call it up from memory. He tells young Republicans in 1955, he says that we are confronted with a greater threat to freedom than Lincoln and the Republicans faced during the Civil War. 1955, Goldwater is saying that. So what is so threatening to freedom? Goldwater has two major threats to freedom that he wants to emphasize in every speech. One is big government, quote unquote, big government. Big government, insofar as he'd been involved in politics prior to getting into the Senate race, he was a critic of the New Deal. He was a critic of the growth of the welfare state. So he sees big government as the threat to freedom. And the other is big labor. So Goldwater gets into the Senate. Robert Taft is the Senate leader when he arrives, and Goldwater is looking to get assigned to a committee that is going to be most closely related to issues in Arizona. But Taft says, I want you to be on the labor committee. And Goldwater says, I don't know anything about labor. And he says, well, you're a businessman, and I want a businessman on the labor committee. So Goldwater ends up taking on this role, and he identifies the excesses of big labor as one of the central threats to freedom. And that's going to be sort of one of the keys to his rise throughout the 1950s to a position of political power. The other thing I want to emphasize about Goldwater's philosophy of freedom is that he's not a really bookish guy. Like, he drops out of college in order to take over the family business after his father passed away, Goldwater department stores. Goldwater's claim to fame as a businessman was inventing boxer shorts that looked like they were covered in ants, called antsy pants. And so he's now just selling a new product. But when he's out on the road talking about freedom, he sort of, he's drawing on his own kind of sense of his pioneer forebears, this kind of like Western libertarianism, I think, is central to Goldwater's philosophy of freedom. But also, he also does this thing, this sort of rugged individualism, and really it's a very gendered language. And I just want to give you a couple examples of that, just to give you a sense of the sorts of things that Goldwater is doing. He says to one audience in the mid-1950s, the motto of the left-wing pack, he calls them the left-wing pack because he doesn't want to call them liberals because he thinks that's an insult to liberalism, is to emasculate the citizen and then give him a $10 bill so that he will be helpless and we can do with him as we will. The left-wing pack has given out a dole of inflated greenbacks as a pacifier for lost manhood. And so Goldwater would talk about these threats to freedom, the ways in which freedom is being undermined by big government and big labor, and then he would always end a speech, as one should, with a call to action. He called on his audiences to go out with, quote, evangelistic fervor to preach the gospel of the free, competitive way of life. So when Goldwater's out on the road doing that, we have another prophet rising. Martin Luther King, 26 years old, is a bookish type. He spent most of the last 10 years reading books, thinking about theology and philosophy, thinking about natural law, which was the subject of the panel before this one. And he's been a pastor in Montgomery, Alabama for less than a year when he's made the head of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which is this group that forms to organize the Montgomery bus boycott, to really, to something that had been in the works for a while, but to really mobilize the Montgomery bus boycott, which of course famously began with Rosa Parks and the story you all know. But King rises in front of Holt Street Baptist Church, this congregation, not his congregation, but a different congregation, a congregation of working class black folks who had no choice but to take those buses. He rises as the leader of this improvement association, and really the story about King getting this position is he hadn't been in town long enough to make a lot of enemies. So he's kind of chosen, by process of elimination, and he gets up there and he gives this oration at Holt Street Baptist Church. Didn't have a speech prepared. Inside the church and then outside the church altogether, there's about 4,000 people. And there's speakers on the outside projecting what he's saying out into the audience. And one of the things that King does that I think captures what I see as sort of his philosophy of freedom taking shape, is he's speaking to this congregation. These are the folks who are forced to ride those buses. They have no choice but to ride those buses to get where they need to go in order to survive. And King, if you listen to the speech, if you go on and listen to a recording, I really recommend that, because you can hear the magic of King as an orator. And James Baldwin, I think, described this really well when he first heard King preach. He said the magic of King as an orator is he could feel the energy of his audience and sort of accept that energy as a gift and then give it back. And so there's a moment, so he starts out kind of slow, and you hear an amen over here and a that's right over there. But then the audience really comes alive when he says, and my friends, there comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. And when he said time and when he said tired, the audience really came alive. And then he leans into that. There comes a time when people get tired of being pushed out of the glittering sunlight of life's July and left standing amid the piercing chill of an alpine November. And so King, gives this speech, and the sort of this language of time and exhaustion runs through the speech, and that ends up running through so much of his rhetoric about freedom and his philosophy of freedom. And what I want to emphasize about King's philosophy of freedom by way of the Montgomery bus boycott is, King, as Don mentioned, he develops an idea of freedom as conscientious collaboration. So whereas we have, just to oversimplify for a moment, Goldwater really emphasizing this rugged, manly individualism, King is emphasizing this idea. In order to pull off the bus boycott, it's a remarkable feat of coordination of conscientious people trying to figure out how they're going to get where they need to go without the buses that they used to rely on. So they're basically developing a carpool system, figuring out ways to alert one another when law enforcement's going this place or that. And so freedom King is emphasizing depends on other people. It depends on us collaborating together. And another element that I think captures this sort of this essence of a kind of collaboration as essential to King's understanding of freedom is I think it's a really radically democratic understanding of freedom. And the moment that I think captures this so well is when King's on trial as a conspirator in the Montgomery bus boycott. He's being questioned by this white lawyer, and this lawyer says, Reverend King, who formulated the demands of the Montgomery Improvement Association? And King says, 4,000 people at Holt Street Baptist Church formulated the demands of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And the lawyer says, 4,000 people can't formulate anything. And then King says, it depends on what you mean by formulate. So the lawyer is trying to get him to admit, wants him to say who wrote down the words on the paper so that he can be convicted of conspiracy. But what King is trying to say is that the formulation of those ideas are from the people themselves. This is radically democratic understanding of freedom. I'm just going to say a couple more things. I have 6 minutes by my count, Don. So I just want to give you a sense Goldwater enters into the Senate, and he's doing some of the things I described. But one of the questions, at the forefront of this book, but it's not the only thing I'm looking at this book, is trying to get a sense of Goldwater and King on civil rights. The reasons for their coming into conflict have more, civil rights is central, but it's not the whole story, so we can definitely talk about that. Economic issues end up being just as central to King's critique of Goldwater. But in terms of questions of race, Goldwater is a really fascinating character. I mean, he's somebody who is complicated, and part of this is I'm still puzzling a little bit over exactly how to understand Goldwater, even after spending all these years with him on these questions. And I have this picture here to kind of capture this, a tale of two Goldwaters. And I have pictured on the left there, much later in life, Catherine Maxwell Dixon, who was an African-American Arizonan who moved to Washington, D.C. Her husband was going to dental school at Howard. And Goldwater hires her as a legislative aide when he's elected to the Senate in the early 1950s, which is remarkable. I mean, at the time, she was only the second African-American legislative aide in the United States Senate. So that gives you a sense in Goldwater. There are all sorts of things that was consistent with Goldwater's kind of personal character on questions of race in Arizona. When he was confronted with these sorts of issues, he actually had relatively progressive racial attitudes. And so he hires Maxwell Dixon. There's one, a couple of the biographers of Goldwater say that when she goes and during her first week of work to go have lunch with her fellow legislative aides in the Senate cafeteria, they won't let her sit with her white colleagues, and that Goldwater finds out about this and has an angry phone call and puts an end to that. There's no press conference, there's no press release, but apparently, this would be consistent with what I take Goldwater to be like, he would have made a phone call and been upset about it and said, let her eat with her colleagues, this is unacceptable. So that's happening. At the same time, Goldwater is cozying up with people like Strom Thurmond, pictured here. You can't see the whole picture there, but he's pointing at the clock. This is after he delivers that long filibuster in order to try to stop the Civil Rights Act of 1957. So Goldwater is identifying Thurmond as a kind of ideological soulmate. Goldwater senses pretty quickly that he is going to be in collaboration with people like Thurmond in the future. One of the remarkable things that one of the artifacts that we have from Goldwater is he starts keeping a diary when he's in the Senate. We all can relate to this, right? You start keeping a diary those first few weeks, it's so robust and you're writing all this stuff, and then you just stop altogether. Goldwater was like that, but in those early days in 1953, when he's just freshly elected to the Senate, he says this in his diary: "I sense here a realignment of Southern conservative Democrats with Democrats and Republicans of the West and Middle West. On the one side," Goldwater wrote, are the New Deal and Fair Deal folks who are, quote, controlled by the labor unions and the stronger minority groups. On the other side would be the Western senator and the Southern senator who believe in the freedom of the individual and the freedom of the states. And so Goldwater is when he's going out on the road, he's talking about free enterprise and states' rights, and that this idea that the freedom of the individual is protected best by what he's calling the freedom of the states, or he also used the term states' rights, which was so central to the ideology of somebody like a segregationist like Strom Thurmond. Okay, Don, we're getting down to 2 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to just give you a sense of this, the sort of, I'm going to fast forward through the story and we can come back to any of these things, but needless to say, King has some doubts about the compatibility in every instance, or in some instances, of this idea of the freedom of the individual and what Goldwater is calling the freedom of the state. So this is the prayer pilgrimage in 1957. King is there with his fellow civil rights activists to talk about the necessity of robust, active federal government intervention in order to promote several things. One, the desegregation of schools, which had been ordered by the Supreme Court and had not happened, right? Two, to vindicate voting rights. Three, to promote economic, to sort of combat economic injustice. Those are the kind of three central things. And so King is casting doubt on all the things that Goldwater is talking about in this period and all the way through. Goldwater is mostly saying we need to stop talking about these things so much. Goldwater says, one of the lines that I quote in the book is that he says, the less we talk about civil rights, the better off we're going to be. So he has the floor of the Senate, eventually has a syndicated newspaper column. He's traveling 40 weeks out of the year, giving lectures all over the place, and he's not saying much at all about civil rights. And mostly he's getting away with it. One of the most remarkable sort of sources in the book, and this is something I had a hunch about this, but had to get into the archive to really find it, was Goldwater is being covered by the mainstream press before he is the nominee, then it becomes a different story, in a very positive way. Every article about Goldwater features him in his flight suit, him in his cowboy outfit. Goldwater shoots from the hip. He's the kind of politician who'll say the unpopular thing if he believes it. It doesn't matter what the consequences. I suspected that the African-American press would be covering him a little bit differently, and they were. And some of my favorite moments in the book is when he's being questioned by reporters, and they're calling him out on this sort of major blind spot that he has on these questions of race and civil rights. I'm going to conclude by way of, so I have this slide here, is this billboard was all over the place. Martin Luther King at Communist Training School, to give you a sense of some of the ways the American right was sort of trying to attack King, both in the form of billboards and millions of postcards they were sending everywhere. And then I sort of conclude the book in 1964. So the book kind of it starts out with like the first few chapters cover about 2 years each. And then 1963 gets its own chapter, and then 1964 gets 2 chapters because so much happens relevant to this story. This is King in St. Augustine, Florida, where he'd be arrested, and one of a series of arrests King experiences as a result of direct actions. He's standing in the doorway of the Munson Motor Lodge, attempting to enter into this public space, a restaurant and a hotel, and he's being arrested for doing so. And part of what's being debated at that very time is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which would make it illegal to refuse somebody service in a public space like a motel or a restaurant on the basis of their race. That same day, when direct actions are happening in the Munson Motor Lodge, Goldwater is on the floor of the Senate announcing his opposition to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because he thinks it would be an affront to freedom. To force proprietors like James Brock, that man standing in the doorway, to force him to serve somebody like Martin Luther King. And Goldwater is opposing it, not just constitutional reasons are central to his argument. He thinks that the public accommodations section of the act and the section of the act dealing with employment discrimination are unconstitutional, but he also makes a moral argument about why he thinks it's important that we go about changing these things by way of moral suasion and not by way of legislation. And he also says there's something about the way we do politics that's at stake here. He says the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has been pursued by way of demagoguery, and we need to be calm and deliberate and patient. And King is there to say time and again, going back to where I started, and then I'll wrap up here, is that this whole idea of time, this is what's central to the letter from Birmingham jail, and many of you will have read that document. King talks about time. Like our perspective on time is going to, in many ways, depend on where we sit, right? Our sense of urgency about a problem, a sense of injustice in the world is going to often be not necessarily determined, but shaped by how that injustice affects our own lives. And so King is there to call Goldwater out on that again and again, and to call on him and eventually oppose him in the campaign. I'll talk about that picture, my favorite picture in the book, in the Q&A if you'd like. That's George Parker. I want to tell you about him later. But King ends up opposing Goldwater. in the 64 campaign, as you saw in that video, and is really central to building this coalition that defeats Goldwater. And really central to that determination that King had to defeat Goldwater was that he thought Goldwater's philosophy, although couched in this language of freedom, was actually a grave threat to freedom. So I look forward to Melvin's comments and to our conversation. Thank you for your attention.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Can you all hear me just fine? Okay, great. So I'm delighted to be here and to comment on, I think, this extraordinary piece of scholarship by Professor Bukola. It is a book that really understands how to tell a philosophical story in narrative form. Right? And in that way, it leans into its readers and takes the reader very seriously. And I think that's because Professor Bukola understands that telling stories is inescapable, is part of how we understand ourselves. And we often tell stories by recovering, as all of you know, our history to remind us of the stock, as it were, from which we come and the character of the people to which we belong. Old-fashioned language, stock, to be sure, but it rings no less true. These stories are noble and sometimes heroic, but they need not involve an epic defense of a country or sacrificing one's life for something greater than oneself. Their heroic quality can be, in fact, very ordinary. They can be as mundane as the parents who struggle to make ends meet, but who manage to shield their children from that knowledge so that they can be kids. This may not be the stuff of novels, but it is all the same part of the book of someone's life. Retrospectively, we note the heroicism of our parents as family tales slowly swirl about us. Those stories nourish us. We lean on them in dark moments. They remind us of our latent strength. Recounting our past also helps us chart our escape. The trauma of earlier days, the bad habits displayed by family and friends, or the troubles of past relationships help us understand where we must go and who we must become. In these instances, we don't look to the past to remind us of our character, its untapped strength. Instead, we discover in our history a kind of ugliness that might serve as the basis for a beautiful life, a soul, an identity informed by, but not ultimately defined by, our trauma. None of this, as you will know, is unique to people. Nations, too, tell stories about their past. Yes, they are composed of a disparate lot, but they are held together by their past, and through the telling of their history, they forge an identity or believe they have discovered one. We can deny this, but it would be wildly inconsistent, I think, with those who experience themselves as belonging to a national narrative. You can opt out of national storytelling, but that does not mean, as the historian Carl Diggler once put it, others less critical and less informed will come along to spin tales of the country to which you belong. Others will come along to answer the inescapable call for stories of nationhood. The stories we inherit shape the horizon of what we can see, what we admire, and what we condemn. They teach us how to name virtue, and they help us point to where evil lies. But unlike the family, the nation's stories are public and contested. They bind strangers into a moral community or divide them. And so the question becomes, what kind of story has America received about itself, and what kind of people has that story made us? In the United States, we regularly recall colonists fighting against domination, what Lincoln called the immortalized founders, figures whose triumphs became the foundation of heroic national self-image. For in that struggle, freedom meant not merely breaking free of interference, it meant a release from arbitrary power, the precarity of existence that comes with arbitrary power. Yet, as every generation rediscovers, those same colonists stood upon stolen land and imposed on black people a form of domination unmatched by the metaphorical chains that they themselves sought to escape. The light of their heroism is dimmed by the shadow it casts. The moral radiance of their resistance, the law of freedom they proclaim so boldly, is equally matched by the ethical darkness into which they cast themselves and all of us. It is this doubleness, this moral radiance and ethical darkness, that I think Professor Bukola's One Man's Freedom helps us confront. His book turns to two men who, in the decade after World War II, received the same national inheritance, yet interpreted in profoundly different ways, King and Goldwater. Through speech, sermon, and action, they carried on a long-distance argument over what freedom meant and what moral life required. Professor Bukola begins fittingly with a scene of reception, December 5th, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama. King is in a church, the sanctuary is overflowing, the air is thick with courage and fear, and this drawn from the book. Rosa Parks has been arrested, and a young preacher, 26, newly arrived from Boston, rises to speak. King tells the crowd they gathered for the serious business of asserting claims to dignity, freedom, and full citizenship. Their movement, he says, aims to turn thin paper into thick democracy. In that moment, he is receiving, interpreting, and transmitting a tradition, the Christian ethic of love, the democratic promise of equality, and the prophetic cry of justice, all fused together in a living faith that he is communicating. But even amid his push for legal action, King knew that the dignity of all people, particularly black people in that context, was a matter of what Paul Tillich would call ultimate concern. At almost the same time, another man was taken to another kind of pulpit. In D.C., Senator Barry Goldwater addressed the ballroom of business magazine editors. His tone, too prophetic. Freedom, he warned, was in peril. Big government, big labor. The true American inheritance, he insisted, was the right of each individual to call his soul his own. His gospel was self-possession, his theology the free market. Both men stood within the same tradition of American liberty, yet each drew a different moral from it. King's inheritance was communal and aspirational. Equality guided and ennobled freedom. But Goldwater's view of liberty was individual and defensive, shaped by a tacit suspicion of equal regard and its power to discipline freedom. The one sought to expand the moral reach of the American story. The other, even when conflicted, sought to preserve its boundaries. Professor Bukola's method is to bang lives together. Those are the words he uses. To see what sparks of truth appear. The writing is breezy in form, but serious in content. And like his previous book, the book on James Baldwin and William F. Buckley, Professor Bukola has mastered the art of narrating the biographical episodes of the lives of transformative American thinkers and distilling their philosophical vision in their time and for us. In reading this book, you feel the lives of King and Goldwater bang together. When we pay attention to those lives, two distinct moral imaginations of freedom emerge. Goldwater's imagination of freedom was cast in the idiom of the frontier. Freedom meant mastery over circumstance. The American hero was the pioneer who tames the wilderness, the entrepreneur who builds from nothing, the citizen who stands alone against the forces that would endanger the self. Goldwater once told young Republicans, which Professor Bukola cited, our fundamental doctrines that the individual comes first, you come first, I come first. The good society in this view is the one that interferes least with that assertion. That was 1955 in the prologue to Nick's book. Goldwater never really moved away from that position. By 1961, as Professor Bukola explains in chapter 4, Goldwater can be found saying to Eugene McCarthy in A debate, quote, the basic question is not a group of people, the basic question about a group of people, the basic question is about the individual. And several years later, with greater force and a moral imperative, extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. King's imagination of freedom moved in the opposite direction. It began not with self-ownership, but with shared vulnerability. The freedom he sought in Montgomery was not the liberty of withdrawal, but the dignity of belonging. His people walked miles to work, organized carpools, endured arrest, and faced bombs, not to guard private choice, but to reveal their common humanity. We are going to stick together, he told them. Freedom for King was relational. The capacity to care for the good of another even when the world teaches you to look away. Both men claimed fidelity to American liberty, but the traditions they inhabited were not, in fact, the same. Although it isn't precisely described in this way in the book, I think it is right to say that King rooted freedom in equality. And Goldwater rooted it in the solitary individual. Goldwater's faith was in the isolated self, and King's, as many of you know, was in the beloved community. The tension between them is the tension within America itself, between possession and participation, between the fear of dependence and hope and interdependence. But Goldwater's gospel of freedom was at bottom also a gospel of anxiety. His refrain, quote, "Can we keep it?" betrays a fear that freedom is always slipping away, that the nation's vitality depends on guarding a fragile possession from encroachment. This conception of liberty could, on the one hand, support measures like the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which he read as securing an individual's right to vote without undue interference. But that same conception, as Professor Bukola rightly observes, led him to resist efforts toward integration, which he saw not as the realization of dignity, but as the intrusion on liberty of private association. President Eisenhower's decision in 1957 to send federal troops to Little Rock in support of desegregation was absolutely unacceptable to Goldwater. But this is actually not precisely because Goldwater held animus toward black people. He wasn't Thurman. He thought that because Eisenhower did this, Eisenhower sought through the power of the state to force a vision of the good that we each must be freely allowed to come to on our own, however long it takes. His Cold War instincts, his constitutional literalism, his suspicion of collective claims all intensified this posture of defense. Freedom in his vision becomes a perimeter to be fortified rather than a path to be traveled, a liberty too narrow to be affirmed fully and equally in all. King's gospel, by contrast, on Professor Bukola's account, gives freedom a destination. He calls for a daybreak of freedom and justice and equality. His freedom is creative, forward-looking, and costly. It demands moral courage and shared sacrifice. For him, freedom is not a possession to be defended, but a calling to be realized, a moral movement from what is to what ought to be. This difference in moral direction remains the central fault line in our civic life. Because Goldwater places so much emphasis upon the license of freedom, equality often feels like a constraint. Equality is in Goldwater, it's there. His 1964 address on civil rights and the common good. But it is guided by this account, this sort of narrow account of freedom that I'm laying out following Professor Bukola. But on this understanding of freedom, integration as a consequence of equality will now appear to be at odds with the demand of freedom. That in fact, where the marketplace of social life must be left free to arrive at its own good, will now appear to be under assault by an affirmative moral position about how we ought to view the dignity of each other and the role that government must play in establishing it in the society. In contrast, King's America sees liberty fulfilled only in equality. One fears that government or the collective will suffocate the individual. The other fears that without moral community, individuality becomes idolatry. Professor Bucola's juxtaposition forces us to ask what becomes of a nation that loses its moral compass when freedom is severed from any ethical claims, when it becomes an empty form that can be appropriated for purposes far removed from dignity. We know the results. Freedom invoked to deny solidarity, to resist the claims of the poor, and to justify resentment. The problem, as King understood, is not with freedom itself, but with our inability to tell its story truthfully, robustly. To receive a living tradition, King teaches, is to expose its contradictions and remain faithful nonetheless. He never renounced America, as you all know. He wrestled with it. He believed that a people could redeem what they had profaned and that democracy could be reborn through confession and love. Freedom, he thought, rightly understood, is not self-enclosure, but self-transcendence. The courage to imagine oneself bound to others in dignity. But he was not naive, as he lamented, white America is not, and these are King's words, even psychologically organized to close the gap between themselves and Black Americans to realize equality. And for that reason, how white Americans often deploy freedom, like Goldwater, will be inadequate to meet the gravity of the racial complexity with which the United States must reckon. The theme of this gathering, and I'll conclude here with some questions, that which I also received, Living Tradition, captures precisely what Professor Bucola's story illuminates. To receive a tradition is to stand inside it and ask how it might live again. It is to inherit both the glory and the guilt of those who came before. King and Goldwater each received the same language, but translated it into different moral keys. And yet, Professor Bucola, as I made my way through your book, I found a suspicion growing in me, one that surprised me. Although I felt disappointed in Goldwater, I suspect rightfully so, I also found myself unsettled by King. I'm usually drawn to him. I began to wonder whether it was perhaps a profound mistake for King to think that proper fidelity to the past, the Declaration, the Constitution, the founders, was the right ground on which to rest his vision of democracy. Yes, there is the famous I Have a Dream speech, but across his body of work, he often invoked the founding as, in his language, the great well of democracy, and regularly described the civil rights movement as seeking to complete a quest the nation had embarked upon at its founding. And it struck me that both King and Goldwater, for all their differences, not only offer rival conceptions of liberty, but they also, where they overlap, tether the legitimacy of those conceptions to the origin stories they tell. Each attempts to rescue the present by appealing to a purified normative past. And I wonder if this very gesture is what traps us. For origin stories settle existential questions about who we really are and the legitimacy of the quest before us. Origin stories are what they are and have the power that they do because we believe that they represent fate or destiny. But if the past is morally doubled, if its stories are soaked in both radiance and darkness, then why are we so confident that fidelity to any version of it can secure the democratic future we need? Isn't the very fact that we're constantly appealing to the authority of the past a betrayal of our claim to freedom? Perhaps the problem is not simply that they tell different origin stories, but that they must and feel that they must tell an origin story at all. But if I found myself troubled by the implicit power of origin stories in shaping what King and Goldwater defended, I was also struck by how distant their traditions now feel. Trump's Republican Party bears little resemblance to the liberty Goldwater imagined. And on the other side, the moral vocabulary of King's beloved community has all but disappeared from our contemporary political discourse, and there is no reason to believe that the left is interested in rediscovering it. And so I want to ask Professor Bukola, what does it mean for a tradition to be received when the political world that once carried it no longer seems to live it? Let me come at this question from the other direction. Your book shows how freedom can be elevated into a moral ideal or distorted into a defensive posture. What then do we make of our moment when freedom is so often invoked, not as a moral calling, but as a shield? A shield for cruelty, resentment, and exclusion. Is this the afterlife of Goldwater's vision, or is it something else altogether different? A final, less dramatic, but I think selfish question, because it's about the things I'm thinking about. Though the book doesn't quite frame it this way, what stood out to me was how often the language of freedom drives the narrative. It appears in this book well over 250 times. I stopped counting. Equality, on the other hand, appears only 38 times. And yet equality seems to be doing the real moral work in King's thought. So I want to ask, does placing freedom at the rhetorical center, which I understand why one would do it, but does placing freedom at the rhetorical center risk obscuring that what King and Goldwater were fighting over was how to give freedom moral and ethical direction? And doesn't their conflict in the end force us to decide how we want the equal dignity of our fellows to function in our thinking about freedom? But in the end, your book forces us to confront a truth we too often avoid. We do not choose the stories we inherit, but we are really wholly responsible for the ones we decide to pass on. King and Goldwater received the same words and carried them in opposite directions. And it seems to me that the task before us is to decide which directions we will carry them now. How will we understand freedom, justice, and equality? That is the burden, it seems to me, of a living tradition. And it is the measure of our faith in each other, and our faith in the democracy that we inescapably share. Thank you, Professor Bukola. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for questions and two very rich offerings from our scholars. We'll go ahead and take questions right here. Yes.
This can be for both Professor Rogers and Professor Bukola, but the way Professor Rogers characterized Bukola's work was Mr. Goldwater is about the individual and MLK is about the beloved community. I was wondering if in our current day, 2025, a more Thomistic worldview could reconcile those two. The highest good, the highest natural good for man is the common good, and the highest natural good for the individual is partaking in the common good. So I was just wondering if you frame the question this way, can't you reconcile these two?
Who wants to go first?
Great, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great question. I don't feel like I've read my clients, as recently as you have, so I'm not going to lean too much into that. But I think it's a really good question. I mean, I think that this question of the common good. Melvin, I think rightfully points out that because the framing concept in the book is freedom. I probably lean too much. I just stopped counting at 250 uses of freedom. I was trying to get at this sort of question. I mean, freedom was, at the heart of what I was trying to do. But trying to, of course, think about freedom's relationship to all these other big ideas, and not only political theory, but how we think about our political lives as citizens. And the common good is another one. And so if you think about this idea of, as you put it, the highest good the highest human good is participation in the common good, or pursuit of the common good?
So the highest natural good is the common good, and the individual's highest natural good is participation in it.
Yeah. I mean, I think I love the provocation. It's good. And I think, and I don't want, there's one thing about, the presentation I gave today, and even in a 400-page book, is there is a kind of, one can't capture, I don't think, all the nuance or all the sort of examples of where the sort of overall thesis is kind of challenged. And so I would say that Goldwater is an interesting character that, it's not like Goldwater rejects the idea of a common good. I think as Melvin pointed out, there's all sorts of ways in which it seems like some of the central commitments that he has militate against that being a central concern, because he's emphasizing this individualism. And yet at the same time, like, he is the product of a movement of collective action, of people getting together and trying to figure out how to to bring about their political vision. So I mean, I guess I would say though that the line that Melvin quoted from that first speech at Whole Street Baptist Church that King gave, that this idea for King of a kind of thick democracy, to me captures a sense in which I do think, King is, I think, more concerned, or he has a more robust sense of the ends toward which freedom is going to be used. And I think that, not that that's absent from Goldwater's view, but that just seems to be much more central to the way King's thinking about the world. And I think, and this is, again, it is a strange pairing in that King has thought deeply about these things for a long time and was always thinking deeply about these things. And Goldwater was much more of a kind of instinctual politician. But I wanted to kind of capture his thinking, or the thinking of those around him who were helping prepare these speeches, to give a sense of like what was it that he was saying, and how was that activating his audiences? What was it, causing them to feel, and how did they think about their relationship to one another as a result of what he was saying? So yeah, it's a great question, but yeah, I don't have a great answer for it.
Melvin, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll just add a quick point here. On page 71, this is Goldwater responding to Eisenhower. Leave them alone, Eisenhower desegregated, sending the federal troops in. Goldwater now talking about the community. Leave them alone, quote, they will eventually have integrated schools, end quote. I don't think that when Goldwater speaks that way, it is sort of cover for his racism. I think it is this belief that if individuality is left to its own devices, it will eventually get to where the good is. But the thing that is obscured is that individuality without proper direction, without foundational sources that can help guide it toward its good, is liable to go in all kinds of directions, right? And often what Goldwater seemed to sanction is precisely the thing that he should have resisted, that he seemingly sanctioned a kind of license with respect to liberty, that often, in the end, undermined the kinds of things that he said he was committed to, and that you can see him enacting in non-legal and institutional ways. So I think that, I wish he was a bit more bookish, to be quite honest. That maybe he would have come to see. He wasn't very religious either, but that maybe if he had a bit of one or other of those things, maybe he would have come to see that we really can't be left to our own devices. Right?
With questions, if you can also explain who you are and where you're from, and that will also give Petra a chance to get over the mic to you. So thank you, Petra, for your help. We had a question back there. Professor Munoz.
Thank you, gentlemen. I have a question, but let me begin just, I guess, with the editorial comment, which is to say I've been hosting these lectures for more than a dozen years here at Notre Dame. Those were two of the finest presentations we've ever had. So thank you very much. Both in excellence and in eloquence. So I'm really deeply appreciative. My question is directed to both of you. Melvin contrasted Goldwater's individualism with King's more communitarian visions of freedom. how does that map onto the state? Because I don't know that what I know about Goldwater, I know primarily through Nick, so I don't have any real independent knowledge of Goldwater. But I don't necessarily see Goldwater as a focus primarily on the individual. Obviously it does, but more as a non-statist, that the state is a threat to freedom. Does King think the state is essential to freedom? Or is the reliance on the state or the necessity of state action for King primarily one of, given the situation, given our historical narrative, given who we are and our faults as a people, that we need the state to act? How central is the state to King's communitarianism? Is the state even essential, aside from being, it's essential now, and here and now, because of our historical experience?
Yeah, thank you, Phil, and thank you for helping us get here to be at this conference, and getting Melvin's comments I didn't get a chance to say were just remarkable. I could listen to Melvin talk forever. Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think that, I think your description of Goldwater is the right one. I mean, I think that his suspicion of government power, doesn't cut across the board. This is the whole thing about the sort of the fear of big government. It's not that Goldwater is afraid of government in every instance, but it's always a question of what kind of big government are we talking about, or what is the government doing? I think that's central. But yeah, and I think that for King, I do think that I don't think he has a fully developed theory of the state or anything like that. But I think it's evident throughout this story that he hears somebody like Goldwater questioning the sort of role of the state and worrying about the role of the state. And as I tried to indicate fairly quickly, I mean in the presentation, King wants to ask this question of Goldwater: is it really the case that quote unquote big government, that an active federal government is a threat to the freedom of somebody whose voting rights, whose economic rights, whose social rights, whose educational rights are being deprived in one of these states or localities? And I think that is so for King, I don't think it's a question of he has this belief in the kind of moral, that the state is always a kind of moral actor or anything like that. Of course he knows it's not. But he thinks, given, so kind of the way you framed it in the question is that given the context, given the history, he thinks that it's, in that circumstance, it's essential for the federal government to take bold action. And I would just say one thing I didn't get a chance to highlight is that one thing going into the research that I didn't know as much about that I learned in the process, and hopefully I get through to the reader, is that, when King is opposing Goldwater during the '64 campaign, he's, I would say, spends almost as much time talking about Goldwater and questions of economic justice as he does talking about civil rights. And when he does that, so we have Goldwater telling us that the state is a threat to freedom, that big labor is a threat to freedom, and so on. When King goes before the 1964 convention. So this is one of those moments in the story where they could have, met face to face, and I don't think they did. But they, King had this practice of going to speak before the platform committees of both the Democratic and Republican parties in 1956, 1960, and 1964. So he's actually there at the convention that nominates Goldwater for a time. He's not there for he's not there for the speech, for example. He watches that on television from Los Angeles. But he's there speaking to the platform committee of the Republican Party prior to Goldwater's arrival. And what King emphasizes, he has sort of three major points, and they're kind of his three major points that he always makes. He wants to talk about the dangers of militarism, the peril of economic injustice, and racial inequality. And so the first thing he says to the platform committee is he wants the Republican Party to commit in a meaningful way to the enforcement of the Civil Rights Act that's just been passed, even though Goldwater has just voted against it, right? So he doesn't mention Goldwater by name, but he says this party needs to make a serious commitment in its platform to the enforcement of the law. The second thing he talks about is the Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged. And I mention that because to me it's a good example of King using radically different language about the state than Goldwater would ever possibly use. King uses words like gigantic and massive when he's talking about the Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged. And when he talks about that, it just, going to Phil's point, he talks about the historical context. He says the reason a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged, which he kind of proposes in his, and he's been proposing for at that point almost a year, or at least a year, is he wants across racial lines a series of what he calls massive and gigantic programs to address the history of economic and racial injustice in this country. He says this will have a disproportionate impact on African Americans because of history, right? But it's across racial lines. And he says that, he talks about the impact of having the system of slavery that had on white workers, right? And this is throughout American history, there's this attempt to divide the white working class from people of color in the working class, and King says we need to remember that. This has all been part of, this is not an accident that the wealth distribution is as it is. So again, I think King is saying in that instance, it's not that he knows the state is an imperfect instrument. He certainly knows politicians well enough to know that you can't trust them too far. But he also recognizes in the circumstances he sees a robust role for the state to play, and he wants to present Goldwater with this question about whether or not we should always have this sort of default reaction that state power is sort of contrary to our freedom, and King is suspicious of that point of view.
Melvin?
Yeah, sure. So, I think all of that is right. King did not think that he wasn't a strong perfectionist, in particular in how he thought about the role of the federal government. He was quite clear that the state is not there to transform the heart, but it is there to constrain the heartless. And he thought in the constraint, conditions are created for us to reflect on what it is that we're doing together. And so in that regard, he thought, look, the government, given the nature of our specific history, the government cannot be indifferent to the relationships among citizens if we take seriously that history has a transforming effect on who we take ourselves to be. I think Goldwater, and much of now what I know about, well, I think now all of what I know about Goldwater comes from this book. But I just, as I read this book, I read it when it was in manuscript form, I read it again when I blurbed it, read it for this. Goldwater just seems to me to be just very, very confused. And I couldn't help but say in the idiom of my mother as I kept reading this, oh, bless his heart. He just seems to be so confused, because I do think he is worried about the role of the state and it trampling on something, which he constantly says, the individual freedom. But what does that mean? And when you press on it, it turns out to be substantively opposed to us trying to figure out what is the common good, right? What is the thing that binds us together? Now, whether or not he reflectively got there or backed his way into it, we're concerned about the consequence of the thought here. And so I think, that anti-status idea leaves us with a very sort of a thin and ultimately cruel conception of the individual.
We have time for one more quick question, right down here. Thank you, Petra.
Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Charlie Stalzer. I'm a PhD student here at Notre Dame studying under Dr. Munoz. And my question concerns moderation, drawing from Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. So is it too much to say that King's passage deploring the white moderate is basically a restatement of Goldwater's saying that moderation in pursuit of justice is no virtue?
That's a long story. We could talk about that, but so there is a story I tell in the book that comes from Harry Jaffe's son, who claimed much later in life, after his father passed away, that the famous language from the convention speech was actually his dad sneaking King's idea of defensive extremism in the letter from Birmingham jail into Goldwater's speech. I don't think that's right. And so part of what, so yes, I mean, I think that, so I would say no. I would say yes, if you asked if it was too much to say. So yes, I think it's too much to say for this reason, is that, this is one of the funny, interesting things about this story, right, is that you do have the most famous line from Goldwater being this defense of extremism, and King himself defended a kind of extremism in the letter from Birmingham jail. And prior to that, there's a wonderful moment when he was in Louisville, Kentucky, speaking to seminarians, and a student asked him, isn't one of the major problems in American, this is like 1961, 62, one of the major problems in American politics, there's kind of extremism of the right and left. And King, I imagine, smiling, says, well, I should confess to you, I'm an extremist. And then he explains, I'm an extremist of love. And he talks about, he refers to Scripture and talks about Jesus as an extremist of love. And that Jesus is rising above his context is the kind of extremism, the way King describes, rising above his environment is the way King describes Christ. And so, so I think that, there's a kind of, so when King is talking about moderation, I mean, there is a way in which you can put their language next to each other and it's the same, but the context is everything, right? So when Goldwater utters those words, the question before, and this is where I don't fully understand where Jaffa, knowing what I know about Jaffa, exactly what his thinking was. But, the question of extremism was before that convention in a very particular way. Like it was, the language was originally introduced by Jaffa in the platform committee because there was what moderates in the party were trying to add a plank on extremism to the platform that would sort of condemn extremists like, of both the right and left, the Ku Klux Klan, the John Birch Society, the communists, and the Goldwater faction was resisting this. And so the language of extremism as it's heard by that audience, as it's understood in that context, had to do with a very particular kind of extremism. I don't think many were worried about the extremism of the communists infiltrating the Republican Party. It was about groups like the John Birch Society, groups like the White Citizens Council. And so King, so he's thinking about something very different there. He's saying in a letter from Birmingham jail, right, the major obstacle is I've been forced to conclude that the biggest obstacle to racial justice in this country is not the White Citizens Council or is not the Ku Klux Klan, but it's the moderates. It's the moderates who are either with us in principle, but keep telling us, well, we just need more time. Give us more time. And so he includes among those moderates, I would say, in a way, I mean, he'll refer to people like Goldwater without naming as right-wing reactionary Republicans, but he'll often have this kind of roll call he'll go through of like what the problem is. And that those reactionary Republicans like Goldwater who have the right racial attitudes when you just talk to them about their personal views, but are unwilling to commit themselves to what's necessary politically, that's the problem from King's point. That's the major obstacle. So I think it's a longer conversation. We could talk afterwards, but thank you so much, Don, for moderating. Thank you, Melvin, for those beautiful comments. Thank you, Phil, and the centers for hosting us. This has been a wonderful, wonderful time. I appreciate it.
My friends, we've reached the end of our time together, and so on behalf of the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government, we'd like to thank our partners, the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. Thank you for being here, and finally join me in thanking our two panelists, Professor Nicholas Bukola and Professor Melvin Rogers. Thank you guys so much.